And good evening and welcome to Out of the Bag. This is Sean Maguire live on Healing Oracle Radio and People's Internet Radio. And it is the 6th of the 5th, 2020. Hopefully you're all doing well around the globe with this massive pandemic and lockdown. We won't talk too much about that tonight because in the first 2 hours of the show, I will be live. Yes, live this time with Ken Scott. Now, I've had some pre-recorded interviews. This is going to be part 5 of talking with Ken Scott and learning much more about getting ourselves away from the ties and the bonds of the psychopathic matrix of debt and slavery. The co-founder of Panterra Private Contract Association, as well as the initiator of Gemstone University and Media Alliance concept. As I said, this is the 5th interview and I'm really looking forward in a few moments to talking to Ken live. And if you've got any questions in the chat room, etc., do have them ready or have a listen and maybe come up with a few during the interview. And I'm going to kick off without any messing, no announcements to make tonight, to introduce live onto the show Ken Scott. Ken, are you with me?
Yes, Sean. Hi, can you hear me?
I can indeed. Welcome to Out of the Bag for the 5th time, Ken. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you broke. Yeah, I heard you say 5th time, but then you broke up. So, sorry, we're still having a little delay with Skype. So, yes, hi. Let's go for it.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we've got a couple of hours to get through information. Now, I just wanted to say that to my listeners, that I asked you yourself, what was the best thing to look at and all the rest of it. So you gave me some videos to look at. Believe me, I've had a very busy weekend. There are hours and hours of very insightful information. And I'm hoping that we can cover some of that tonight, Ken.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll start off. Sorry, go on, Ken.
What you're referring to? Go ahead.
No, go on. What I'm referring to.
All right, go ahead. Yeah. No, I just wanted to clarify that what you're referring to are the videos available to our private society members. You mentioned Panterra as a private contract association. Yes. We are first and foremost a private society. There is a distinction. We can cover that in a minute. But the Gemstone University has content, some video, but mostly written documents that's available to the public. Mm-hmm. But the vast majority of what we have produced to go into the depth and the detail of everything that you're making reference to is only to people who've signed up and enrolled as members. And I can explain why that is wherever we are in the conversation, and kind of explain and give some context of where we're going in the near future to make this much more available to a much wider audience.
Yeah, no, it would be good. And a lot of the information, once you get to know what it is, there's a lot of logic and history, I suppose, learning a bit of history about how the banking system was formed, etc., etc. There's lots and lots of historical, I suppose, anecdotes that we need to call up into our memories now to sort of move forward with that knowledge.
Yeah. So I think it's appropriate. Let me start with defining what I just mentioned. Okay. As I have mentioned in the earlier calls and discussions, I've been studying law and related things in history, money mechanics, the world system for just about exactly 30 years now. And in the course of all of that, what I was looking for in real solutions that were based on the way the law and the world system was actually constructed. A lot of people are out there with a lot of knowledge, or some with a little bit of knowledge, or anywhere in the spectrum in between. Unfortunately, even with a lot of knowledge, you can miss applying it because one doesn't understand how the entire structure and system actually works. And so fundamentally, when we started putting together Panterra d'Oro, the form of a private society was paramount and foundational. Essentially, every form of an entity or a governmental body or a religious body on the planet starts life first as a private society. And if you look at a very foundational work that came out in the 1770s called the Law of Nations, and it is really the basis of national structures that have been created over the last close to 250 years. And the very first clause or first article states that a nation is a society of men. And obviously, they did not include women at the time, but it said a society of men with a like-minded intent or purpose.
Okay.
There, the entirety of what we know today as nation states or religious ecclesiastical bodies started first as a society. So based on that, understanding that, we created Panterra de Oro as a private society. The definition of private within that context is it did not go into the public system, such as the United States or any other national jurisdiction where people create corporations, whether it's the UK or the Bahamas or Hong Kong or Panama, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those is a national jurisdiction. And if you go into that jurisdiction or any given jurisdiction and you say, okay, I want to create a corporation or a private or an association or a foundation, you are actually doing so in their jurisdiction and therefore bound by their jurisdiction system of codes and laws. So, but that doesn't mean you have to do that. And we have proven that to be the fact by forming our private society 20 years ago, nearly 20 years ago, and establishing what a society fundamentally has the capacity to do, which is its own jurisdiction, its own law form, its own treasury, its own court system, and basically it can also, through its treasury, create its own private monetary system. And that is what we have done, out of which then we created something called a private contract association. And that's based on those three words. It's private, not a public entity. It's based on contract between two or more parties. And it's also not deriving its authority to come together as an association of individuals through a public statute. So we did that, and it's fundamentally important to be able to protect and preserve what we do. And this is one of the key areas many people don't understand in law because they're investigating or researching many aspects of law that impacts their lives, whether it's the money system, the banking system, mortgages and foreclosure, all those things that we're used to, and those are operating or functioning in the public system. And even though you may understand a vast amount of the codes and the statutes within any given jurisdiction, say for example the UK or the United States, you are still a public entity. You still are beholden and bound to things that are constructed within that public system that on the front end, it appears that they're done fraudulently, but when you dig really deep and you peel the layers back, you can, if you are open to looking at it, you can and will find how it actually has attachment to us. And I'm mentioning this because about 45 minutes ago, one of my associates here at the house where we work mentioned your call 2 weeks ago with Michael O. Bernicia, and talking about mortgages and what he's done. And it was just new to me, so I was just quickly listening a little bit to the interview, looking a little bit at his film. So I can't speak authoritatively or comprehensively about it, but his fundamental is identifying or declaring fraud in the mortgage or the banking system. And it may be that, but also at deeper levels, it actually may not be. And that takes, as we've discussed before, a lot of education, a lot of willingness to really dissect and peel all the layers to understand how law and banking and money in the world system is constructed.
I mean, how difficult is it to have it? Is it obvious to us you say you got to peel the layers. Once the layers are peeled, are the truths obvious to us that we can work on and act on?
Well, that's a really good question, and we can't begin to answer that for every individual man or woman, whether it becomes clear and obvious. The thing to keep in mind, and many people who are investigating the world system now and all the things going on and wanting something new, many of them will say readily, yes, we are in a completely propagandized media system. What you hear in the media has spin, has twists, it's propaganda. Much of it is mind control. I would say, from my point of view, virtually all of it is mind control. And so the beginning point is for any given individual being to engage with this. The beginning point is to let go of what we need, what we think we know, and let go of thinking we are on top of it. And that includes letting go of believing that we're not subject to programming and mind control, because we are. Mm-hmm. And so one of the primary things that we address within the Gemstone University educational process is really stating that from the beginning as a given. The given being, yes, I am under mind control, and much of what I think is real in the banking system or the law system or current events is propagandized, and it is twisted. And in order for me to see clearly of how it really works, I must be willing to let go of my presumption that I know what I think I know. Because for the most part, we really don't actually know what we think we know. We know what we've been told. And even in digging very deep into the legal system and so forth, there are many, many ways where there are loops and boomerangs and twists and back to, referencing that takes us back to the point of attachment that is what we need to truly see before we can start severing and eliminating those attachments.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the fact that that the propaganda is there. It also, I think, in one of the videos you mentioned the wonderful tube stations in London, and when the tubes pull up to the station, you hear the announcement, "Mind the gap." Yeah, maybe you could elaborate on that, but
yeah. Well, it's just like many, many things that that when you pay attention and you think in terms of the repetitiveness of things that actually are continuously programming us. On the one hand, on the surface, it seems like, well, that's a logical thing. When the train pulls up, there's a gap between the platform people are standing on and then the point where you're actually standing on a solid platform within the train. There's a gap in between. So it's logical for the voice saying continually, mind the gap. But if you think about it, it is also saying in reverse, because our minds work both ways, forwards and backwards. Language is often programmed where what's said forwards is actually being said backwards, especially the English language. I'm sure you've heard of reverse speech, where we have digitized recording where we can play it backwards and actually hear something that's hidden. Yeah. So if it's backwards, mind the gap can also be gap the mind. And, it's a relatively inconsequential point because there's a lot more broader, deeper, and wider mechanisms by which we are separated from our true capacity to think and clearly understand something. But our minds have been gapped. The separation between what we perceive as real, what the program mind through indoctrination in school and media and many other things, what it thinks as real versus what actually is taking place right in front of us. And, you can reference that phrase. It says, for those with eyes to see. And I know this is an absolute because I've been working with people for 3 decades to have them see something that is visible if you cognize it, if you recognize it, but it's invisible if you don't.
Uh-huh. Right. Well, I think that's a great analogy, though. I mean, I know that more hypnosis and more MK Ultra type of, I suppose, programs are being used globally all around the world. But I just that tickled me, the Mind the Gap in the tube station, and it really highlights it in a nice, in a simple way, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. And, I think we don't want to go too far with that. We could spend an hour just talking about all those examples, but there's a myriad of examples of things that are stated in language. And then, and we're just talking about regular vernacular, but if you take legalese and the legal system and the language of the word in law, the distinction between what we would normally take as a generic or a vernacular word versus what it means in law. There are two important books that we direct our members to get hard copies and start cross-referencing. One is Standard Law Dictionary, and there are many law dictionaries that have been published over the last 150 years. The one most known is something called Black's Law Dictionary, and the first publication of that was in 1891. And progressively, they issued more and more editions to now they're up to 11 or 12. But Black 6th edition was produced in 1991. It's a 100-year anniversary. And if you read the preface of that, it basically states how they are changing the language and the definitions in law all the time. And those who study law understand that Black's Law Dictionary is basically the Crown or the Queen's dictionary. I mean, it's owned completely. It's a copyrighted instrument. All law books in the United States are published by a company called West Publishing, which is now owned by Reuters, which in turn was founded in the early 1850s and has been owned by the Rothschilds for 170 years. So the Rothschilds own through Reuters West Publishing, and you open any book, whether it's a dictionary or any law book that they publish, whether it's Black's Law Dictionary or revised statutes or case law or whatever, in the first couple of pages it says this is private copyrighted material. Well, if it's public law, how could it be privately copyrighted? And because it's not public law, it's actually private law, and it's owned and copyrighted by that particular company, which gives license to attorneys and the judicial system to use their copyrighted material. But if you read that preface and you look at it and you take another book called Burton's, Burton apostrophe Thesaurus, Law Thesaurus, and a thesaurus gives you synonyms and related concepts and foreign phrases like Latin and so forth within the law, and you break down how a word is defined in Black's, but then how it has cross-referencing in the thesaurus in Burton's. You start to see many things that you didn't understand in law. For an example, the word account. If you look in Black's Law Dictionary, the word account has many correlated phrases, such as an open account, a closed account, a stated account, a referenced account, and things like that. And so we go to the bank and we say, well, I want to open an account, and we open a bank account. We consider that it's an open account. But what's happening behind that when it goes into other stages or levels of an account, as it is processing and settling different things, both public and private. Let me see. I just lost my train of thought. There was another word, the really important word.
Well, we were talking about accounts then.
Yeah, I'll come back to it. But anyways, so you cannot presume that you know what a word means in law or in the court unless you really know how it's being used and how it is actually defined and correlated with other meanings and when those two books as a start, but much more in terms of the bills and the acts. And I know what I was going to say. So you start with the word account, then you go, and I mentioned bank account, but if you go to the gas company or the electric company and you open an account, and every month they send you a bill, and most of the times we define a bill in our mind as a certain definition. But we look at they send us, and it's an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, at least here in the States, that's the size. Okay. And generally it's divided in 2/3 on the top and 1/3 on the bottom. And on the bottom third, it's referred to as a receipt or a voucher. And when we get a tax bill from the IRS, it specifically says it's a voucher. And so, and it says, disconnect or sever the voucher from the top part and send it payment. But if we go to the Law Dictionary and the thesaurus, the word voucher means, among other things, the money issued to pay for the account. So actually when we get a bill, we are, and it also means a receipt. And what do we get when we go to the store and we buy a loaf of bread and we give them some a euro or a pound note or a U.S. Federal Reserve dollar note? They give us a receipt. So why would they be giving us a receipt that they call a voucher? Voucher is defined as the payment for the bill, because that document that they call a bill or a statement has two components. It has the bond on the top, which is actually creating the monetary obligation, but it has the voucher that actually provides one with the prepayment of the account. And so understanding those kinds of definitions of words and the mechanisms built into things, suddenly an entire reality opens up that we never knew existed before. Yeah. And that's just one key example of understanding how we see something, but we really don't see it.
Yeah. And no wonder so much skullduggery goes on inside our courts, because they know the different connotations of what different words mean, and the general layman doesn't.
Correct. Absolutely.
So let's look at status correction, Ken. I watched the first video from your November 1st seminar, and it's got such good information in it, but I wanted you to explain maybe the two pillars and explain how that works and what they mean.
Okay. All right. Well, they don't directly necessarily apply to status correction, although fundamentally or foundationally they do. But the two pillars concept is an esoteric symbol, as well as something that's actually physically constructed in going back thousands of years in Egypt and Sumer and Babylon, and then coming into the Roman period and post-Roman, which is really an oxymoron, because we're not in a post-Roman period, we're still in the Roman period. But suffice to say, thousands of years of religion and temples and architecture and symbology and all of that. The original structure or mechanism by which temples were oriented to their relative to relationship to the planet, to the sun and moon and stars and the astrological sphere that we find ourselves essentially enclosed in, was that if you were standing on a flat plain and you were facing directly east, where the sun would rise exactly on the 2 days of the year known as equinoxes, where the sun was rising essentially on the horizon on an equal point, that it would then deviate off of the next day, going through the next 180 days, going up to the far reach, which was the solstice at the far north or the far south, and then it would return again to that equinox point every 180 days. If you had a single pole and you were holding it one point on the ground and the sun came up on the equinox, it would create a shadow. If you then did it on the two solstices, it would create two shadows that basically were at an angle to that original equinox shadow. Mm-hmm. So you imagine you have three shadows. And if you think in terms of, what the peace sign looks like, where there's a shadow going straight down and then two angled shadows, right, or lines within a circle. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do, yeah.
Okay. So imagine those three lines, the two angles and the straight angle, is what I'm talking about in the shadows in relationship to the movement of the sun and the planet in relationship to that over a 365-day orbital cycle. And the two angled shadows would create 2 points that would be used as the definition for the entrance to a temple entry. Okay. So the orientation of the entrance would be due east, and that's why in our language, in the English language, we call the east the orient, because or back then, they were orienting that design layout with that corridor going directly east. And then you would have 2 points on either side of that entrance, and this is where they would put the two pillars and as an entrance. Then they would have an arc or an archway over the two pillars, and this would define the inner space through which the people would enter and would be basically essentially captured or brought into an inner sanctum that was controlled by the religious and textual, sacred, scriptural texts of that religion or church or temple. And just like we speak of jurisdiction, if I go to Mexico, I'm in its jurisdiction, I have to follow its rules. If I go into Walmart here, it's a private corporation. The minute I cross the threshold, I'm in its private jurisdiction, and I've accepted to bind myself to its rules. So whether it's a corporation or a larger corporation that we call a nation, there's still private societies, private enclosures into which I enter if I choose voluntarily to walk over the threshold, and now I'm bound by its rules. And in the entirety of the ancient periods, the esoteric construction of the temples and everything that was related to the temples, those two pillars came to represent two definitions or two lines of authority, and one was the line of the king and one was the line of the priest. And the line of the king controlled all of the land. So if you look at the Babylonian period and related Sumerian Babylonia and civilizations in that time period, 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, the concept of a king was inculcated into the population to say that the king held and was vested with the divine right having been granted from the gods above. So a king now has divine authority, and through that, the concept of absolute divine dominion or overlay to control the earth was essentially established and has been followed and implemented into all the legal and monetary and jurisdictional systems on the planet as we have it today. And of course, I'm sure you're aware of the 3 crowns that were originally issued as a declaratory statement by a papal bull starting in 1302, saying that there essentially were 3 crowns. If you look at the Pope and the conical hat that he has, you can see 3 actual crowns, and that's in the one hat. Jewelry, medals, gemstones, hats, many things, staffs, And you can see there's a very clearly there's three circular crowns on those images. And so that was known as the three crowns, or the triregnum, which means thrice, three times regal or royal, emanating from the claimed and proclaimed and declaratory position of the Pope and the papacy and the Vatican, that was outpictured to become three city-states: Vatican City, City of London, and Washington, D.C. And so, and at the same time was declared that the Pope owned all land, all flesh, and all souls. And this goes into a lot of the esoteric stuff that I've gone over in the videos on the Gemstone University YouTube. There's a video called How It All Fits Together that was done actually 9 years ago. So we've advanced a lot of the knowledge about it, but it's still fundamentally quite accurate. And so to understand this completely, that's the best place for people to go. Right. And I describe in there what the two pillars are, what the line of the king to declare absolute authority to own the land, and the line of the priest to declare absolute authority to control all of the law. And it is all interrelated, correlated together when I speak of, the two pillars, the orientation to the east, the corridor of the entry coming into the church or temple or church, and that becoming the domain of the priesthood that says, if you want to come in here, you follow our law, and if you wish to go to where we say we have the authority to direct and guide you, aka heaven, or to reintegrate with your soul or your spirit, you must come into our law form because you're in our jurisdiction, and we're the only ones that you can follow our laws to be able to gain access to where you want to go. So this has been vastly extended over 5,000 years to become the secular as well as the religious construct in this world that binds all people to the laws of the priests. And the laws of the priests is not just found in the Bible or other scriptural texts, but ultimately it's found virtually in every single legal code and statute and system that binds the people to who have attached themselves by a voluntary form of contract consensually to be attached to the jurisdiction, essentially, of the priest. So when you're talking about medical issues right now, you have literally a global quarantine and lockdown affecting 3 to 4 billion people on the planet, instituted by national state entities or local municipal jurisdictions, or in the United States, what we call states, or in Canada and elsewhere, provinces. There's still the secular authority that stands in front of the religious authority that says you must follow our binding rules that we call laws, and ultimately it all goes back to the point of origin of the law of the priest. And then if you follow the historical lineage over the last 5,000 years, but especially the last 500 years, you will see how ultimately everything led to this entity called the Crown Corporation in the city of London holding all of the land, or presumptively saying we own all the land because the Pope in 1302 and onward declared that as such, and nobody essentially has rescinded or removed the presumption of consent, or for all events and evidence, almost all the 7.5 billion people on the planet have actually agreed to that. Okay, the crown owns all the laws. So there's the line of the king and the line of the priests. I mean, the crown owns all the law. And but the substance of law within the modern Western English system basically says that if you want to have some standing, some authority, some capacity to do something in law, and there we must define law. Is law the codes and statutes that bind us all that are essentially the law of the priest, whereas law, the substance of something that in the most elevated expression in the system says that the people actually are the highest authority in the law based on what happened in 1776 and onward. But almost all those people contracted that authority away, and they exchanged it for other rules that gave them limited benefits and rights that are called civil rights, but are not unalienable rights, because an unalienable rights means it can't be liened. A lien is a commercial attachment where there's a bond or a debt attached to it. That's why in the Bill of Rights it refers to unalienable rights, not inalienable, but unalienable. And the minute you agree to attach a lien, a commercial attachment that has a debt obligation attached to it, now you've lost your unalienable rights because you're liened up. And so you have commercial attachments, and that commercial attachment ultimately leads back to those two pillars of the two lines that I've just described.
So was that, but going back then, was that the first ever trust that existed when the Pope, the Unum Sanctum, the Pope claimed all the souls, etc.?
Yes. Well, there may have been other trusts, and there were trusts that were forming in the first crusade was in 1096 to 1099. That's when Jerusalem was basically captured by the Western states, and they held it for, I think, 180 years or something like that. Then there were several other crusades. During the very beginning of the crusades, the concept of a trust started emerging, where the men who had landed estates, who were going to be going off to war on land, going east on these crusades, they didn't know if they would come back, so they had to set up some form of lawful mechanism that if they didn't come back, that their estates could be settled and passed on. So that created a preliminary basis of what we would call a trust form in the last 1,000 years. But then in 1302, the papal bull that we're talking about that started it is known as the Unam, UNAM, Sanctum, and that basically means sanctified or holy unity, and in Latin. And that created a global testamentary trust. And when we speak of a trust, you're speaking of splitting absolute title. And so, and the way that works, you create a title that's considered legal title that trustees have authority and control over, and you create a beneficiary or equity title that the beneficiary or beneficiaries of a indenture or a document that's expressing a trust, putting property in the legal control of the trustee for the future benefit of the beneficiaries. Now you have two titles, legal and equitable. And I don't want to go into real extensive discussion about trust and legal and equity title, because it's a large subject. It's an important one. It's an essential one. But the point relative to what we're talking about is that when the Pope said, "I'm creating a testamentary trust," well, what does that mean? It's a testament that established a future relationship between property and designated beneficiaries. So on the surface, it essentially is saying the future beneficiaries of this testamentary trust are being expressed by me, the Pope, with absolute authority as the holder of the apostolic succession, and the position of holding that as what became known as the vicar of Christ. The vicar is one who has vicarious standing for the true owner. So, so the whole storyline is somewhere in the future, the true trustee will step in and take hold of this testamentary trust and its body of property and so forth for the ultimate beneficiaries would be those who step into the enclosure of Christ in the future. But it is set up so that if Christ never shows up and says, I'm him, and I can prove I'm him, now you give me the authority over this, and I will take care of the beneficiaries. And because they knew that would never happen. So until it happens, the so-called vicar or the office, being the office of the papacy, would hold that executory control over that body of property as a global estate. And under trust law and estate law, that if there's no settlement of the trust or estate, it will be perpetually or continuously until it is ended in the control of the trustee or the executor. Yeah. And this gets into how trusts work, how estates work, how trust law with the two titles and the legal title, and then also the very specific definitions of what an estate is, who is the administrator and executor of the estate, and how that operates during the course of the waiting until the beneficiary can step up into essentially claiming the estate and taking control over it.
How did
so this was set up
no,
from...
Go on, Ken.
Pardon?
No, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, essentially, this all started in the year 1066, when the Norman conquest took control of London, and what was established there in London for the previous, basically, close to 1,000 years. And there were many things that were established in the territorial soil of what's now known as and officially designated as the City of London. And, of course, the Norman conquest coming from the continent, from what we call France, and who William was in his relationship to the Pope. It was taking control over that territorial jurisdiction in the area we call London. And then what proceeded out of that came several dynasties in the British royal lines, leading up to King John in the year 1213, who actually abdicated his control over the crown and his titles and his territory, and he gave it to the Pope at that time. Mm-hmm. And so, that period from 1066 leading up to the early 1300s was establishing various foundational things in the English law form. Law, equity law, the nature of trust and estates, nature of legal trustees and equitable beneficiaries, and so forth. But it was always set up to be a perpetual, never-ending mechanism to administrate and execute the global trust and the myriad of billions of individual trusts that the beneficiaries would never have standing to be able to claim and take control over. Okay. And so the key to answer to open up the discussion, what is status correction, is eventually this led to the creation of nations under the law of nations, societies of men coming together under and around the authority of a crown that was vested or placed on top of a so-called royal head by the Pope or his authorities, to create a superseding claim on all land under the doctrine of discovery that said that any Christian king who had been coronated by the Pope could plant his flag on land that, if no other Christian king had claimed it, would become that king's land. But they even recognize in all of that the original indigenous people actually were the true owners of the land. They just simply came in Of course, they tried to genocide them. They tried to isolate and virtually destroy them socially and otherwise, and take over a legal and corporate structure that maintained the estates of that global estate, corporate, national form that became defined by the law of nations as societies known as nations that eventually became corporations that eventually became bankrupt and took all the people and essentially lifted them, legally speaking, off the land and put them into a control or containment mechanism to operate their lives through subdivisions of those corporations called a franchise. Mm-hmm. And so our status has always been, during this period since we were born, those of us who are less than 80 years old, we have always been bonded sureties because we're the surety that guarantees the obligations of the debt to the franchise that we operate in. So we're sureties bonded to a bankrupt franchise. And that's how it's been formally and absolutely basically since 1933, progressing through World War II, and then the other mechanisms of the global banking system, the World Bank, the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, the United Nations, up until basically the month of March of this year.
Yeah. Have we got the authority individually to get out of this situation? I mean, obviously that's, I think, what we're doing with status correction. Step one would be to remove ourselves, revoke and rescind all the things that have gone before. And would it be right that we can actually do that by saying, I made a mistake?
Yeah. Well, exactly. That is precisely the language that we start with. I made a mistake. And the law recognizes mistakes. And if we start from the starting point, which we've discussed before in our previous discussions, that at the largest level of things, in a universal sense of things, we exist in the universe. That universe has many galaxies in it. Those galaxies have millions and billions of solar bodies and solar systems and planets and so forth. But ultimately, we're in a universal fabric of creation, or a field of creation that we would call unified in terms of fundamentals of principle. And in the universe we're in, that fundamental is that all individuated expressions of consciousness, which you are one, I am one, 7-8 billion humans on this planet, millions and billions and trillions more throughout the galaxies and so forth. There is one underlying foundational principle, which is we are endowed and invested with sovereign free will. And so the only way for any being to be brought into a jurisdictional system or an authority that's separate or, outside or outside of my inner being, your inner being, and so forth, is by agreement, by contract. Contract is the most fundamental principle of law in this world that we're in. Because, and again, people would say, well, how do you know this? Well, I know it from studying law for 30 years. I know it from all of my inner work that I've done for 65 years, the work I've done with others in studying many, many systems in this world. The correlating and corresponding data and facts and information overwhelmingly support that all law in this world is based on contract. This is why in the United States, the original federal constitution and all state constitutions and all subsequent federal constitutions have the clause that says no state has the right to impair the obligations of contract. So if you and I enter into a contract and it's a valid contract across the board and it has agreement or clauses of consideration that constitute, in effect, obligations of the contract, no state can impinge on that unless we also gave that state jurisdictional attachment. So if you came here to California and you and I entered into a contract, and we said, the law of this contract is our own private law, and then later in the contract we say, but the place to adjudicate any disputes is the state of California and its judicial system. We've just opened up our contractual private law to the state of California. Yeah. And so then it's not really private law because we've just invited in all of the code, statute, and law of the state of California, which in itself is attached to the United States, which is attached to the UN, which is attached to the banking and money system. So then our private contract is fundamentally attached to and must follow or accommodate all the other jurisdictional attachments that we opened up to. But when we created Panterra and we said this is a private society, we did not go to any jurisdiction and say we want your authority to bless us, to give us, authority to exist. No, we proclaimed it, we gave notice, and it has stood now for close to 20 years. And I've had many, many, many situations where external authority came to attempt to claim or attach jurisdiction, and I, with very simple letters, without going into war, going into polarity or separation with them, I simply politely said, no, you don't have jurisdiction here, and these are the reasons why, and they have 100% of the time gone away. And then we created a private contract association, the same thing. So this is a fundamental law that many people out there studying law, attempting to address the issues with banking or mortgage and foreclosures and all the other things, are attempting right now to tell the states that they don't have authority to force them into quarantine or wear a mask or do this or don't do that. Mm-hmm. What they don't understand is they have voluntarily contracted to those authorities and gave those entities the authority to bind them with essentially the law of the priest. So if we have entered into a contract and we discover through our own research and education and related endeavors to understand what we've attached ourselves to, and we come to understand that we made a mistake, mm-hmm. and we begin a process to correct that mistake. And essentially when we're talking about contract, we're talking about three things. We're talking about the right to rescind a signature, the capacity to revoke a power of attorney, mm-hmm. given by that signature, and ultimately the resulting event being to terminate the validity of that contract. Mm-hmm. So we rescind signatures, we revoke powers of attorney, and we terminate the contract. That is a fundamental mechanism by which we can start to achieve status correction. But the other thing is, up until the time we do that, we have continued to use the function of that contract, the function of the benefits and the privileges that were conveyed to it, aka citizenship, the right to operate in commerce, the right to use their mail system, their monetary system, and all these things. And through that monetary system, we've created an abundance of claims and obligations of contract that we can't just walk away from. We can't just say, oh, it was fraud, I made a mistake. Well, you can say I made a mistake, but you can't say it was fraud, because if you really understand how the whole quantum whole of the system has been constructed, it's not constructed on fraud. Now, there are many instances in the banking system, in the mortgages and so forth, where, yes, we can identify that there's a lot of things that are being done that are fraudulent or have the appearance of fraud, but in the fundamental contract that we entered into, we essentially entered into a contract to operate through a franchise, to function in commerce, to buy and sell, eat and drink, to have the privilege of living in a house, that we may have our name on the deed or the mortgage or things like that. But what we did fundamentally through those contractual relationships is we allowed our signatory authority in the underlying estate to be applied to a commercial document, such as a mortgage or a loan or a deed of trust. And we created property that belongs to the state, because the state is a bankrupt debtor in possession, aka we'll just refer to the United States. And so everything that was created from March 9th, 1933 until last month was being created as property of the United States, that all of which, all inclusively, was held as collateral against the ongoing issuance of monetary debt that was done within the structure of the bankruptcy. So a lot of people have a lot of pieces, and they think that they can walk away from those obligations, and they can't. But once you do correct your status, and there are other things in terms of the underlying estate and the underlying equity of that estate that then become available for you to use to offset, settle, and close those obligations. Mm-hmm. And that's what we teach, and that's very important to understand, that you don't resist it. You don't declare it a fraud. You don't say, well, it's a fraud, therefore I'm not obligated to it. Well, if that's the case, why did they have the ability to foreclose and take tens of millions of homes and buildings and so forth from just the American people, not talking about the UK people or Australia or everywhere else? Probably hundreds of millions of homes and properties and so forth were taken over the last, certainly over the last 50 years. And if we polarize with it and say, well, it's a fraud and I'm going to fight the fraud, then I can guarantee you've already lost. If you don't go into battle with it and you understand that there are steps that can be taken to satisfy, settle, and close, removing the attachments that you allowed to be applied to yourself, that's a whole different path.
Yeah. Now, I have to ask at this point, you stated quite rightly and explained why it's not a fraud, but it is deceit, isn't it? I mean, we how do we know what to rescind if we don't know what we've actually signed up to fully? And we're not actually told, are we?
No. Yeah, and, from a purely human point of view, from a sense of rightness or universal principles, there's no question that there's, there's a vast level of facts, and I'm better qualified than almost anybody to bring all those in play and lay them out and say, there was not full disclosure, there is deceit, there was no meeting of the minds, and so forth. But again, you have to put yourself in the mind of those who brought all this into place. And when I say the mind of those who brought it into place, I do not see that human minds actually devise a system, which can get us into a whole level of another level of discussion. Well, what mind or intelligence actually created this? And the simple answer is artificial intelligence. Well, that would take us down a path of several hours, going into what that's about. Well, we'll do that next conversation.
Okay.
But the point is, over thousands of years. Go ahead.
Well, the AI, it's like, even if it is AI, Ken, it's psychopathic and it's controlling, and it's manipulative.
Well, it's artificial intelligence, which means it's vastly computationally intelligent at a level that certainly almost every human on the planet can't achieve. Yeah, and it's psychopathic. It's the entire system we're talking about is a system of death. The people who participate in it, whether you want to define it as a satanic, ritualized system where they, sold their souls to the devil and gained worldly capacities. Well, we're watching all of that crumble right now. Maybe, let's forestall a conversation about that for at least a few minutes. But however you want to define it, it is certainly, and I could, and this is what we do in Gemstone in some of my talks in many places, go through words and phrases and language and religious constructs and secular constructs and so forth that we could talk for days about how we are precisely in a cult of death. It is all based on death. So it is, if the dishonoring of life and the destruction of life for the fulfillment of individual benefit is psychopathic, which I would go for that definition, then yes, it is completely psychopathic. It's sociopathic. The individuals who are in positions of power, whether in corporate executive offices or banking or political office or places unseen, they are completely devoid of any sense of life, and everything they do is oriented to death. And we've described that and discussed that before in our talks, that it's basically a parasitic structure that only knows how to feed off of a host. It does not know how to create of itself. And what we are living through right now is basically the disengagement, the pulling off of the living host of that cult of death and that parasitic construct, which will eventually just consume the host and destroy the life force and the life of that host in feeding its own self-supporting mechanisms. And that.
Oh, we lost you there for a second then.
In what's unfolding. Oh, okay. How about now?
Yep, you're grand now.
Okay. And that's basically what's happening right now. It's happening one by one on an individual basis. People might ask, well, does that mean I have to study all this stuff for years and years and take all these steps? Not as an absolute, although it is extremely helpful to start learning and understanding, because it's a matter of consciousness. And as our consciousness grows in awareness and opens those hidden areas where the kind of things we're talking about only were sustainable and only functioned in the darkness, well, then opening our conscious awareness to seeing all of these things, learning actually what is the truth within the systems of law, money, banking, and so forth, then it starts breaking it down. It starts attenuating its attachment and control, and the whole of the living body starts expanding and strengthening. And when a body builds and strengthens its immunity, parasites, whether they're viruses, bacteria, or other forms of parasites, biologically speaking, or whether it's a mind virus that has controlled the minds of humanity for thousands, perhaps millions of years, the strengthening of the life force and the immunity is what actually ultimately expels the virus.
Nice.
Or the parasite. So,
that's really good.
in many systems of thought, or I don't like to use the word belief, but, call them internal processes of exploration consciousness, exploration, revelation, and awareness that eventually became calcified as religions or New Age belief systems and things like that. But in the origin of clarity of awareness, it has been said almost, I would say virtually universally, that this planet has been under quarantine for millions of years. Mm-hmm. Why is it under quarantine? Because of the virulent nature of this parasitic attachment that we're talking about. And so isn't it interesting that right now we are going through a period of time that's very small in time, 2, 3, maybe 4 months of quarantine against a potentially lethal, virulent parasite that when you understand the nature, biologically speaking, of parasites, a parasite is not a living organism. It actually emerges from the cellular structure of a living organism, and then it becomes what we would call infected because it starts to it is actually an immunological response to a body out of balance. Nice. And so right now we're in a quarantine period. We're in a virulent period of virus that supposedly is going to kill millions and millions. But it's just essentially a fractal in time. Yep. If we expand that we've been in quarantine for millions of years, we've had a parasite that's been feeding off of cannibalizing, essentially destroying the host of the living body of humanity in this earth. And we are waking up to that virulence in a period of quarantine and beginning to strengthen the immunological response by the living host to start expelling that parasite. Then it's something that's happening now in this world at many levels, quantum levels, multidimensional levels, fractals in time, that we are living through in what appears to be a small sequence of linear time, but is also as well in a much, much larger, broader sense. So the awareness brought about by the breaking apart, the word apocalypse means to split, open, and reveal. So we're in an apocalyptic period, and I like to refer to it as we're riding the waves of the apocalypse, and we're opening it up, and it's being revealed such that in the light of revelation, and I'm not talking about biblical or religious revelation, but the revelation of removing veils to our that have clouded our awareness, then what we're really doing is finally and ultimately expelling a parasite that has fed off of our living body for a very long time.
Yeah, it's incredible. Listen, I've got a question from the chat room. Inshen is asking, he's saying, I'm wondering what's the significance of what seems to have changed last month from 1933 to last month.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hang on. Having a little sip of water.
Yeah, no
problem. Okay, I've described it before in our talks, and I do it in many other places. I'm just going to rapidly summarize something, which is that the United States of America and the original United States as it was created in the 1770s and 1780s started as one form and had the proper republic or the perpetual union that was established, and then the sovereignty of the states and essentially the sovereignty of those who were qualified to stand in law on the land and have the ability to elect representatives. And that was flipped over going into the Civil War and things that were created in the 1870s to create a corporate entity that had the image or the similarity to that original union, but it was just a corporation, and that corporation was really under the Crown Corporation of London. And then it was put into a position of insolvency. The inability to pay its debts is what insolvency is described at. And on March 4th, 1933, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, was inaugurated. If you pull up on the internet, you put a search for the first inaugural speech of FDR, you will find some very interesting, if you peel back definitions of words. Essentially what he did is he consecrated a religious order on that day. The very first sentence of his speech was, "On this day of national consecration." If you look up the legal definition of the word consecration, it means to turn something into a sacred relic or artifact of a religious order. So this is where the ultimate of taking the experiment of a people who had sovereign authority and were not under a hierarchy of a king or a priest or a pope, they had flipped it around and turned it into a religious order that was controlled ultimately by the Vatican and the Crown. 2 days later, on March 6, he proclaimed, you look up the word proclamation 2039 and 2040, he made a proclamation that there would be a 3-day banking holiday. And that's not just a weekend with an extra day as a holiday, that's actual cessation of all banking and monetary function. And that would last 3 days, which was conforming to law. And then on March 9th, there was something called the Emergency Banking Relief Act that, without going into too much detail, essentially put all of the authority of the banks and the money system under the executive branch. At the same time, that act made reference to that all the persons within the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof were now essentially considered an enemy of the United States. So you have, and then it also gave the authority to continue to do proclamations and orders coming out of the executive to do whatever was required to protect the bank and the monetary banking and the monetary system of the United States. So from that point forward, and also Proclamation 2040 extended the bank holiday indeterminately without a point of termination until the office of the president declared it as over. That has never happened. So we've been essentially in a banking holiday since March of 1933. That banking holiday is under the authority of a single office, the office of the executive, to, under proclamations, orders, and various things, to maintain whatever was required to maintain the corporation to operate as a debtor bankrupt in possession of its assets. And then it put mortgages against every living man, woman, and child, and all the property of the collateralized debtor bankrupt in possession. Then the Federal Reserve note became the reserve currency for all central banks on the planet. As such, if they had the Federal Reserve note as a currency, that was under the authority of the president. Then all of those national corporations were put into bankruptcy. That effectively, ultimately gave the office of the executive in the United States authority to control every central bank and all the collateralized people and property attached to the domestic monetized debt of UK pounds, sterling, euros, Australian dollars, and so forth. It put it all under the control of the executive. Now, if you also look up the office of the executive in the late 30s, early 40s, an office was created. So we're not talking about the president per se. We're talking about an office called the Office of the Executive. This is what now is completely, not anymore completely, but was completely infiltrated and infested by a parasitic infusion into that office of what people call the cabal or the deep state. They took control of the executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, et cetera, all to maintain a perpetual bankruptcy and a perpetual attachment of monetized debt to every living human on the planet. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely.
Okay. So it was all designed and intended to have a cooperative psychopath who cared nothing about the true benefit of the people or the planet or all animals and plants and water bodies and everything else under that attachment of the executive office to put the final plan into place. And of course, that original being, the intended being, was known as a person known as Hillary Clinton. Right. And I hesitate to use the word being because I don't think there's a being left in that form. And as with many other humans who basically have been just like science fiction movies, like the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where, this little pod shows up and you're sleeping next to it and it has these tendrils that go up your nostrils, and before you know it, the being inside has been removed and the body's been snatched and it's taken over. So it was intended to finalize the whole program, the whole plan during the last 3 to 4 years. That's why they hate Trump so much. That's why they attack him incessantly, because they're trying to, undermine him. That's why they brought the coronavirus out, to try and undermine the economy and everything else. But it was always known since the last 3.5 years what the plans were, what was going to happen, and what the measures would be and would take place in order to completely reverse it all, to use all those positions available to the president under the office of the executive to basically flip it over and use the entire construct against that deep state. So that has been what's been happening in the last little over 3 years. And the entire system of national corporations in bankruptcy since basically 1933, and then when the UN was formed in 1944, all of the members of the United Nations are national corporations. Are bankrupt, pledge their central bank and their domestic currency through the UN to the IMF and the World Bank and the BIS, and many of them are registered as corporations within the United States Securities and Securities Exchange System. And the game plan was to collapse it all and then restructure it in a absolute unescapable perpetual bonded debt enslavement system. Instead, what happened, and I can only generalize this statement, I can't give detail, but as the course of the year goes on, we will have more conversations and I'll be able to share more about that. But essentially the bottom line is the whole event that was supposed to go one way was actually done, but it went another way. And so the final liquidation and closure of all that global bankruptcy through the national corporations was affected recently, and there is about to be birthed. It's in the final throes of labor. Mm-hmm. It is being birthed an entirely new system that over the next months is going to start energizing through the monetary system and the economic system, through that office of the executive and the president and so forth in the United States and progressively throughout the globe. And so the most important thing for people to be clear about is that instead of believing that the deep state, the cabal, the New World Order is taking absolute control of all of our lives in this entire world, that they've already lost. They're going to be facing their own karmic
retribution
bills. Yeah. Retribution. The bill is coming due. Yeah. And the ability to hand off karma and offset it against monetary debt and basically avoid facing what they have created is essentially gone. They cannot do that. And right now, essentially, their karmic load is being removed from the population of this world, and it's coming straight back to roost to those who created it.
Yeah. Well, they've certainly created a lot of problems for a lot of people. I mean, you know, I personally am doing okay, and my family seem to be doing okay. But I do look out there, and there are people who are, you know, they're losing their jobs, they're losing their livelihoods. They've got no way of life unless this lockdown finishes.
Yeah. Well, it's going to finish soon. And unfortunately, it's unfortunate and true that a lot of people will come through not unscathed, and they're going to have a hard time. But this is where humanity has to come together. Yeah. Doesn't mean there's not going to be casualties. There's already casualties, and the number of casualties certainly, I have no doubt, far exceeds anything as a result of the virus and all of that. And it's unfortunate, but it is a fact that there are a lot of people suffering and are going to already have or will have their lives decimated. Yes. But, you know, I'm looking to the relative near future over the next 6 months and then over the next several years. I absolutely know that what's coming is going to be so foundationally strong and secure and enable people to start coming together, helping each other, helping their neighbors and those who have been not only undermined by this current event, but the last many decades. There's, I don't know what it's like in where you are, down in London or in the UK or the British area, but, you know, here in the States, there's hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people homeless. And, what they're having to do right now to survive is probably quite extreme. But there will be the means and the mechanisms to actually start helping people actually get real solutions where they can be taken off the street. And you know, what it really requires is the people to finally wake up and stop giving their power and authority to these absolutely psychopathic institutions that have been destroying our world for decades and centuries and have been trying to implement, re-grab their power and control over the last several years, but they've lost it. It's already a done deal. They are completely bereft of any authority, except for and unless what people give it to them in these last weeks and days of their waning positions.
Well, we're still caught in that construct, aren't we? And a lot of people don't know how to, I suppose, reclaim their power back from the authorities who think that they own us, you know, and those psychos who think they own us. The problem is the people think those psychos own us too.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a real spectrum. Is like a a thermometer that you don't just turn on or off, that it increases the output, say, of a heating system as the ambient air increases in heat. So one metering part of it will be going down, the other will be going out. That's basically a rheostat. So I look at the human population as two metered systems. One is the relative number, which right now, even though it's a pretty good sized number compared to 10 to 30 years ago, it's still minute in the global population, but it's growing rapidly. And that part is the awakening in consciousness. So that is increasing, while the control and the power vested outside of itself of the human race is progressively increasing. Now, does that mean we're going to go into a brand new, totally free system? Actually, not at all. There's going to be a lot of mechanisms where, there's going to be essentially a global governing body. Is it the New World Order that's been proclaimed by the Bushes and the Clintons and Joe Biden and all the rest of it? No, it's not going to be under the control of maniacs and psychopaths, as many people thought and still think. It is a global governing system, but it's going to enable people to step up and have the ability to start building a stabilized and strengthening value and wealth creation, so that we can actually start rebuilding sane and balanced systems without all of the poisons and toxicity in our food and water and air and all the rest of it, and balanced systems in social structure, things like fundamentals like health and housing and education and things like that. And this is what we've been building as a foundational template in Panterra for the last 20 years. And I also can't go into much detail now, but over the months to come, as you and I meet every month, Sean, I plan to share much more of what we're doing and what we can do together in terms of building that foundation, one of which is through media and education, and what by necessity we've had to keep private, the way I described it in the beginning, that our education is largely private. It's accessible to anybody who chooses to become a member, but we had to keep it private because of the nature of the way the public-private relationship works. So a large part of our education has been private to members only. But over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to have the means and the resources to build a globally deployed media platform. And it's going to be totally free to anybody who wants to participate. It's going to reproduce all of these systems that have had media functions, whether it's a YouTube or the communications platforms like Skype or Zoom and so forth, attempting to be private and encrypting and being attacked because of that. And the all of the foundational and constructional content that has previously been private to start, and that you, because you have been a member for the last couple of months, Sean, that you started to be looking at in Gemstone, most of that is going to be restructured onto this platform that I'm talking about and made available to people anywhere on the planet without being a member of the private society.
That's definitely a step in the right direction, Ken.
Yeah, and then so people may think it's this vast, untenable, unreachable ideal that we can actually start building new, manageable, and sane, decentralized structures for self-governance and building rebuilding social structures and health systems and all the rest of it, but it's really not. And there again, it takes that deprogram, breaking down that propagandized, mind-controlled belief that we had to live under a hierarchical, top-down dominating system of control that controlled our minds, controlled our lives, controlled our ability to create and things like that. But if you look at the way humanity's been going with innovative and leading edge technology and in media and communications and so forth, we've been going into decentralization. And so the education that we're going to be building is going to create a basis that people could start understanding that this is not a fantasy, that we can actually build decentralized systems of media and communications and even monetary systems that don't give hierarchical top-down dominant systems the absolute authority over our lives. And then within that, people will be able to start learning the building blocks of what we refer to as status correction and how to actually do that.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. I think most people will want to get down to the nitty gritty at some point. When do you think we'll be getting to that point? Will it be a couple of months down the road, or maybe even longer?
Well, probably the first phase of it will be some between 3 and 6 months from now. Right. That will start with a website that will be accessible with a lot of the now private education made more public. Then the global media platform will be built on a distributed or decentralized technology that I won't go into now, but in the next month or two, I'll start describing it. And that'll probably take a year to 18 months to actually build, or at least build the practical foundation upon which we will keep building for many years to come. And as far as status correction, which I know many people out there, and it's frustrating for me to talk about status correction and talk about what we've done and talk about the fact that I've been able to do this for myself and other of the Panterra members who have been able to politely and in neutrality rather than in polarity and going into basically into war and battle, be able to say to public entities or agencies or officers that, no, you don't have jurisdiction, and so your calling card doesn't apply. Yeah. And so the frustration is that I have, and I know a lot of people out there listening have, so okay, well, Ken says he does all these things, but I want to do it too. But keep in mind, this took thousands of years to build. It took hundreds of years to build in the modern sense of what the United States corporate entity became as a global construct that put everybody into slavery. It's not going to be unwound overnight or even in a short matter of a few years. In terms of the Western system, so this doesn't necessarily apply to China or other Asian countries, but anything within the European, American, Western legal system, there are three fundamentals of systems of law. In the United States, you have a basis of English common law and the uniqueness of the Revolution and the interim documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, vesting the American people with a unique capacity to do something in terms of claiming status and claiming the law. And so we would just call that the American law form. Mm-hmm. Secondly, you have the English Commonwealth system. So you have all those countries, the UK, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and all the other countries that have the English law form in their social and legal structure. But they're all considered subjects to a crown, as opposed to the American system where the people are considered, if they correct their status, they're considered the sovereigns on the land. So there's a lot of similarity between the U.S. and the Commonwealth system, but there's some differences. So we have been applying our work that I've done over the last 25 years and really perfected as far as the status correction process over the last 6 years or so. In the last 2 or 3, we've been applying it to breaking down the Commonwealth system and how to precisely effect this within those Commonwealth countries. Then there's the third level, which is called Roman civil law. And Roman civil law was primarily in Europe, not counting British Isles, and Latin America. And there's a reason why it was those two places, because Rome, 2,000 roughly years, 2,200 to 1,800 years ago, militarily conquered all of Europe. So all of Europe came under military conquest and was put into civil law as a management system of conquered people and territories. And Roman civil code and Roman civil law is the corollary to admiralty and bankruptcy. So when a system goes bankrupt on a sovereign state level, they're put under admiralty law, the law of the sea, not the law of the land, and civil code and civil procedure is brought in to manage the conquered people and territory. So this was done in all of Europe, roughly 2,000 years ago, while Rome as an empire still existed. Then they created something called the Holy Roman Empire, and they had prince electors and qualified electors and principalities, and that one or the other became the holder, the house of the Holy Roman Emperor. And that ended up being the House of the Habsburgs in Austria, Vienna, Austria, from 1430 into basically the early 1800s. And in the interim, in part of those years, the crown of Spain, which was held by the Habsburg family, became the Holy Roman Emperor starting in 1520 and then conquered all of Latin America through war and conquest. My Roman civil law became the codified management of conquered territories. Yeah. In the history of the United States, when it went bankrupt the way I described, they implemented Roman civil law as the management structure within the United States. So, and then in between, the same thing happened with the Commonwealth countries. So Roman civil code, admiralty jurisdiction, maritime, and bankruptcy must be understood as being the control system in legalese, and this is what the monetary system is based on. Yeah. And it's all Roman conquered territory on a global scale. So to reverse that, we need to perfect what is necessary to have this available to men and women on American soil in North America, aka the United States, moving it through the Commonwealth, and eventually or gradually perfecting the ability to claim the land in the Roman civil law countries that I've just described. So, because at the ultimate sense, this planet is under military conquest.
Yes. Yeah.
And so understanding all of this is part of the educational framework and foundation that we all must learn, not all 7 billion people, because it's not going to happen. But if we actually were able to get several million, 10 million or 20 million people to actually go through a learning process to actually unravel this, both in legal terms, monetary terms, and consciousness terms, then there is a sufficient quotient there that can actually, in effect, remove the parasite of the this universal force that the war, violence, domination, and control, and ultimately situated itself sort of as the showdown at the OK Corral, the last stand of, holding off complete, submission to that and reversing that. And that's who we really are. The people who are listening to this call, those who have been awakening through either going through legal problems and hassles and battles, or spiritual internal processes or health processes, rather than seeing all of that as, oh, my life got lambasted, I lost my house, I went into chronic disease or this, that, or the other. Look at that as the wake-up call that we all purposefully set ourselves up, design our lives through multiplicity of lifetimes to be here now on this planet, to wake ourselves up, to become the liberating force of this world, and in actual fact, this entire universe, to stop this unrelenting parasitic force that has attempted to own life, and by owning it, they were destroying it.
Yeah, it's certainly very. It sounds like a really cool concept to bring peace to them, because they are constantly at war and they want us to be at war with them, and that's how they win, isn't it? Is by being at war. I was just wondering, there's
and
always...
that's how they win.
Sorry, Ken.
Well, I just said that's how they win, by going into war, going into battle. The only way to affect what I just described is going to peace, bringing peace to ourselves and peace to this world.
Yeah, absolutely. Returning to innocence would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, original innocence. What a concept.
Yeah, that would be beautiful. I've got a question from Brian in the Skype, and he's saying, what's the significance of 72 hours, 3 days?
Well, in the United States system, there's an act passed by Congress that was and is called Truth in Lending Act. And it requires truth in lending. It requires complete revelation of all the terms and conditions in an act of executing a loan. And it relates to real estate loans, creating mortgages, consumer loans, virtually anything where there's an act of lending that creates a commercial attachment, creates a commercial lien against the whole mechanism of what I've described. So in that act, there's something called Regulation Z, and Regulation Z provides for the absolute right to rescind one's signature. Can you hear my cat in the background?
You can indeed, yeah. That's okay.
He's agreeing. He likes to talk. Hey, Django, come say hello to everybody. So, yeah, that's right. So, in any loan process, under Regulation Z, within the Truth in Lending Act, we have the absolute right to rescind our signature in a period of 72 hours. So when you go to a mortgage settlement, escrow settlement, where you're going to have the mortgage created, you're going to have a deed of trust or a mortgage attached to the secured interest of the so-called lender, the property and all of that. If you go to that mortgage or that escrow closing and you sign something, the first thing you sign is a promissory note, which you are actually creating the money that is commercially tendered to the agent, the escrow agent, in acting for the benefit of the seller, and then all the other documents are settled, and you have the right of rescission. Remember, I said earlier, we have the right to rescind our signature. And we're not just talking, when we're talking about on the spiritual, multidimensional level, each living being has a unique frequency signature that identifies us in all of creation. And they're all unique. There's no two that become homogenized and, automated as far as coming out of a production line template. So we're not only applying our wet ink signature, we're applying our energetic being signature. And so we have an absolute right to rescind that. In the legal system, when we're creating a loan agreement, we have 72 hours. But if you expand that and you think about that, when we apply our signature to a loan, in the case of a mortgage, what we're doing is we're binding ourself, our living substance, our unique signature frequency to a death instrument. Mortgage means an oath or a pledge of debt. So we are putting ourselves voluntarily into a tomb of the dead. We are voluntarily acquiescing and agreeing to be subsumed under a parasitic relationship to a system of death. Now, you think of the story in the New Testament where Jesus was said to have been crucified. He was said to then be taken the dead and put in where? A tomb. For how long? 72 hours. Well, if we don't look at it in the religious binding mythology of this is the one and only Son of God, and he came to pay all of our sin, all of our debt, but as a metaphor of who we are as a being of mastery, that we are the master, but we've been crucified on the cross of time to be put into a linear construct in a system of death in which we bind our living being to a cult of death voluntarily, and we are put into a tomb. Now, if we do not then rescind the signature and start returning to life, then basically we're in the tomb. We're in the level of purgatory where we are not technically alive. We're in the legal and the taxation system considered what's called a decedent estate. And the term is decedent in Black's Law Dictionary will define it as define decedent as dying. So we are decedent, we are dying the minute we enter into commerce, the minute we bond ourselves to an oath of death and all the rest of it. And until we remove ourselves from that tomb, we are effectively dead. We're acted upon by the system as dead. So the storyline in 2,000 years ago is both energetic, it's metaphorical, and it's literal as it relates to commerce and equity and the state of true living versus bondage and debt. And that's why the commercial system created an act, created a legal code and statute that said we have an opportunity to rescind that signature and rise from the dead and shed solitude of the dead state that we're in for as long as we're in commerce. Now, people will say, well, I signed my mortgage 20 years ago or 5 years ago, and I signed the consumer loan for my car last year and this and that and the other. Well, it goes back to what you said earlier. We can declare a mistake. Yes. Oh, I did not realize what this was all about. I didn't realize that disclosure was out there, but it was under the auspices of the esoteric system, hidden in plain sight. I was ignorant and uneducated, but now I'm fully aware or partially aware, moving towards full awareness, and I made a mistake. So based on my mistake, I am rescinding that signature, and I'm taking the steps to walk back into life and remove the trappings of death and remove myself from the tomb.
Brilliant. So is that reclaiming one's estate, as it's put?
Yeah, that's part of it.
Yeah, part of it. Anyway, look, so much information. I hope that answered Brian's question. I think it did. Ken, we've only got a couple of minutes left, 5 minutes left. Is there anything that you think we should cover before we finish off?
Any more quick questions you got on your chat that...
There isn't in the chat. They all seem to be listening, but not asking questions.
Okay, all right. Well, let's say took us an hour and 50 minutes to get to the Q&A. Let's encourage everybody to get some more of the substance of everything under your hat. Put it into your head. If you go to Gemstone University in YouTube, there's the how it all fits together. There's numerous other interviews and lectures I've done, and there's 4, and this is the 5th. We'll post that on our YouTube channel. Of course, it'll be on your blog space as well. Listen to these 2 or 3 times, and what I've done with you, Sean, in the last 5 sessions has a vast amount of detail. The best way to do it is to listen slow. When you hear a concept or a word or a point, stop the playback and write it down. Start building a study form in which you start putting your head around it. Get some big butcher paper and drawing out what I've described, because what I've described gives you the ability to start deprogramming your mind and breaking down the limitations of the mind control system that we have all grown up in. That's one very important thing. The other is to go to gemstoneuniversity.org, and there are 2 very important documents on there. One is called The World System of Bondage and Control and Separation from Life. That's 153 pages, but it's got a huge amount of detail as well that complements the recordings that I just mentioned. And read that slow and dissect it and take notes and write points down. There's enough information in there that would build literally a postgraduate basis for understanding the world system and law and the money mechanics and the system of bondage. The second document on Gemstone is the what is called the Master Plan for Panterra and Gemstone. It's actually pretty outmoded. It really needs to be updated, but the essential building blocks are still the same. There's a lot of described pieces that have fallen by the wayside, but the basic fundamental of what we are going to build, which includes the decentralized distributed model for the media, and building physical locations regionally around the world as living universities. And this may seem like a very far-flung, idealistic plan that has no capacity to actually be fulfilled, but we really do have what's necessary to do that. And in the next 3 months, we're going to stop taking active enrollments for new members. But if you go on Gemstone University where it says join now, there's going to be in a few days new documents that describe the transition we're in, and how, if you're interested to be part of what we're doing, wherever you are in the world, that door is open, and it'll tell you how to apply and submit what's requested. And we will start building teams, but we need people who are really committed. We're going to stop needing to take monetary donations that we've used to support building everything to this point. And now the price of admission is 4 things: your being, your passion, your commitment, and your excellence. And if you're willing to bring your being and your passion to actually be part of building a new world, and you're committed to do that in a way that will be mutually beneficial and supportive, so that you'll be able to with whatever your skills are. And we're going to need many skill sets: people in media, people in writing, editing, content development. We also have some major projects already in place, ready to go. We have a fully contracted agreement with the country of Sierra Leone to come in and start building infrastructure that's going to include housing, education, medical, physical infrastructure, a major bridge and port, road system throughout the country, and we're going to be able to develop models and templates with the full cooperation of an entire sovereign country of 7 million people to start showing that a new way of doing things in this world actually is possible.
So their government is in cahoots with you. Their government is into this.
Yes, I wouldn't use the word cahoots. That's got some funny meaning. But, yes, I went to Sierra Leone almost 13 years ago. I used to be, for the last 42 years, I was in the diamond and gem and jewelry business. So I went there to explore building a foundation for something that we call Diamonds Are for Life, where we would be mining diamonds and using all the profit to actually come back to the communities instead of raping and exploiting all of their raw resources and leaving, broken lives behind. That we would actually start working together and building housing and all the rest of it. So we have very wonderful, amazing partner there who actually is the nephew of who was the former president. When I arrived in September of 2007, his uncle was just inaugurated as president. And we've worked together for 12 years to build a relationship with the government.
Great. And
in the last 10 years, we've built a means that would be matured and ready to go in this time to actually have the financial means to do this. And we're going to bring in agriculture projects, reforestation projects, new water systems projects, and, literally work in partnership. So not cahoots, but in partnership with the government.
It sounds very exciting, Ken, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more in the coming months. And we've come to the end of this 2-hour interview, and I just want to say thank you so much, Ken Scott, for coming on Out of the Bag. But I want to remind people, check out www.panterrapca.org, check out www.gemstoneuniversity.org, and of course the youtube.com/user/Gemstone University, and check out the YouTubes there as well. Ken, as usual, loads of information, and thank you so much.
Sean, thank you. I really appreciate you and everything you do to support not only me, but lots of people bringing truth and awareness and excitement to the people. Just everybody keep in mind that we are only putting a close to a long, dark period of human history, and we are activating an extraordinary period, and all it requires is your being, your passion, your commitment, and your developing excellence to actually be part of building a new reality.
Lovely. Thank you. Ken Scott, I'm looking forward to next month when hopefully you'll be back with me. Thank you so much for coming Out of the Bag again.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye now.